This episode of My Weird Record Collection discusses one or more records that have religious content. Having said that, nothing in this episode, or any other episode of this podcast for that matter, should be interpreted as promotion, rejection, or mockery of any religious views or lack thereof.
Instead of thinking about the heaven we go into and the sweet by and by, we ought to have a good marriage in the nasty now, so that our kids can identify with a home instead of a house, and a marriage that's holy instead of hellish.
Gentlemen, get the thing straight once and for all. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder.
That is, 1/2 of a 10 milligram tablet daily for a few days, increasing the dose by 5 milligrams every other day.
Welcome to episode 15 of My Weird Record Collection. I'm Sean, your host, and I'm coming to you from the city of Chicago, and I'm taking you on a trip among my odd world of strange, miscellaneous, and otherwise uncategorizable media for your turntable. In this episode, originally released February 2025, we're going to take a look at Bob's Marriage Repair Kit by Bob Harrington, the Chaplain of Bourbon Street. Before we get into that, I just want to kind of babble for a moment and just let out my anxiety. Well, maybe not anxiety, more like annoyance in that, remember before when I talked about Logic Pro, the program that I use to record this podcast, and how if I export a sound with the microphone still turned on, the resulting file is dead silence, and that was a new feature or bug introduced at some point. Well, Logic Pro has since had 2 updates, neither one of which fixed that problem, which has caused me a little bit of annoyance. But I'm going to try really, really hard this time to not let that happen. Yeah. I do wish to make a correction, though. In episode 14, when I talked about Conquer the Video craze, and I mentioned the various pay one price, play all day classic video game arcades that are in the Chicago area. Again, they are in many areas, both inside and outside the US. But I mentioned Galloping Ghost Arcade and that it was south of Midway Airport. Well, I was corrected by a listener. It's not south of Midway. It's actually a little bit north and a little bit west. Now, here's why I said it's south. And I was wrong, of course. It's because when I go to Galloping Ghost, I take Interstate 55 south to get there. And when you're heading down south on 55, you come across Cicero Avenue, which is the first exit southbound for Midway Airport. And then there's another exit after that, farther southbound on the interstate, and that's Central Avenue. And then the next exit after that, still heading southbound on 55, is the exit that you normally take to get to Galloping Ghost. The thing is, and I did not really keep this in mind, I never really examined this on a map, even though 55 is technically a north-south highway, it actually stretches west. So it's more like a west by southwest direction at that point. So it kind of throws the senses off a little bit. And also, once you get off 55, you kind of have to jigger your way up and around some street grids a little bit. And before you know it, you're actually north of Midway. So I sit corrected. Thank you for pointing that out. But you know what? I don't want to take up too much of your time on things other than the topic at hand. So enough of that jibber jabber. Before we get into Bob's Marriage Repair Kit, let's learn about Bob Harrington himself. Now, I had never heard of Bob Harrington until I found this record, and apparently he was a pretty well-known guy. Bob was a very flamboyant, kind of over-the-top Baptist minister who, in 1962, was given the nickname the Chaplain of Bourbon Street by the mayor of New Orleans, Victor Shiro. Bob was born on September 2nd, 1927, not in New Orleans, but Coxheath, Alabama, although Bob considered Sweetwater, Alabama to be his hometown. And before he was a minister, Bob joined the U.S. Navy, where he became a professional photographer, and then he was an insurance salesman. He married Joyce Compton on January 18th, 1947. How do I know that? Because he says so on the album Bob's Marriage Repair Kit.
January the 18th, 1947, I responded with an I do to this kind of a thing.
Bob and Joyce had 2 daughters. There's Rhonda Joyce Harrington Kelly, who died just 2 days shy of a year ago from the release date of this episode. And there was Mitzi Jane Harrington. Bob and Joyce also had a son, Robert Gray Harrington, who unfortunately died as an infant. Although his parents, Robert Coleman Harrington and Lutie Schultz Harrington, were Methodist ministers, Bob didn't declare himself a Christian until he was 30 years old, and he became an evangelist. In 1960, the Harringtons moved to New Orleans so that Bob could attend the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, and he began preaching outside with a microphone and a Bible where he felt there was a major pocket of sin, the heart of the French Quarter, Bourbon Street. Some of the deacons from First Baptist New Orleans spotted him money for a few months' rent for a chapel on Bourbon Street, so Bob went ahead and opened that chapel, and he would preach not just in that chapel, but also in bars and strip clubs in New Orleans. Here are some of the things that Bob is known for. For one thing, in 1968, he held a revival at the Castle Hills Baptist Church in San Antonio. Guy and Evelyn Linton, who owned a strip club nearby, attended the revival. The next day, they closed the strip club and posted a sign saying, "Closed forever, see you in church." Another thing that Bob is known for, he had public debates with notorious American Atheists founder Madalyn Murray O'Hair over the existence of God.
And nobody's ever put you in a nice little cozy jacket all of your own in a nice little padded room.
Yeah, my wife and her mother-in-law, when I got converted, my wife and my mother-in-law, when I got converted, they took me to a psychiatrist to have me adjusted, and I led him to the Lord.
The debates were so popular that the two actually had a 38-date debate tour together, but as the tour went on, people were starting to think that the whole thing was actually staged, so attendance dropped off. Now, Bob, despite being a very preachy Christian, had to admit that Madalyn Murray O'Hair actually knew the Bible better than he did, and he acknowledged that she studied every single page. In his own words, "Yes, many may say Madalyn knows the scriptures better than I do, but I know the author." In addition to preaching, Bob released 8 books and over 30 albums. Now, Bob is no longer with us, I should say, but according to a couple of obituaries I found, his 1965 sermon album, Laughter, Truth, and Music, won him a gold record for more than $1 million in sales, and he later received another gold record for Chaplain of Bourbon Street, which was the audio from his first TV special. There is a little problem with this, though. Number one, gold records are not awarded based on dollar amounts. They're based on units sold. Albums are awarded gold, and they were back then too, for selling 500,000 units, a unit being an individual record. Which does mean that, yes, if a 2-record set sells 500,000 copies, that's actually 1 million units sold, and therefore it would certify as platinum. But anyway, as I like to do some fact checking, I looked at the RIAA Gold and Platinum database at riaa.org, and guess what? There is no mention of Bob Harrington or even the word chaplain or Harrington. So I don't know where this gold record assertion comes from. Kind of reminds me of episode 12, in which I learned that apparently Lil Wally was certified, what was it? Something like 14 gold and platinum records combined, yet I could not find any evidence that that actually happened. I am going to acknowledge, though, that it is theoretically possible that the RIAA does not have the absolute most up-to-date database. I can neither confirm nor deny that. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Bob in a bit, but for now, I'm going to tell you about one of those over 30 albums he did, Bob's Marriage Repair Kit. I don't have an exact date, but Bob's Marriage Repair Kit was released sometime in 1974 on record, cassette, and 8-track by World Records, which was a Nashville record label that specialized in country and gospel. World Records released many other Bob Harrington records, at least one Little Richard album. Remember, he was also a preacher. And Richard M. Nixon Commemorative Edition Second Inaugural Address. Those are just some of the records put out by World Records. Now, Wikipedia had a picture of Bob's Marriage Repair Kit in their entry for Bob Harrington. However, the caption claimed it was 1965. There's a problem with that. On the record, Bob mentioned his daughter Rhonda marrying Chuck Kelly, Kelley, by the way. If indeed that record was released in 1965, that would have meant that Rhonda was 14 years old when she and Chuck were married. I went into Wikipedia and changed that date to 1974. You're welcome. Because this is an audio podcast, I mean, it's about records, and why would a podcast about records be anything but audio? Spoiler, I do post this on YouTube, too. Anyway, I should be as descriptive as possible about the record. The front cover has a red background, and about 3/4 of that front is taken up by a drawing of a briefcase with the words Bob's Marriage Repair Kit written on it in all caps, bold, a white, slightly serifed font. To the left and overlapping part of the briefcase is a waist-up picture of Bob, who is wearing a gray suit, a pale blue shirt, a red tie, and he's holding a red book that I can only assume is a Bible. Below the briefcase, there is black text that has the word including in a scripted font, and underneath the word including, there is kind of a list of bullet points in a way, with the following concepts in quotation marks, all capital, all bold. Are you old enough? How to have a happy marriage? And is your marriage on the rocks or on the rock? Now let's flip over and look at that back cover. Like many records, the back cover simply has an off-white background. On the top right, there's the catalog number, R-5 in small print, and the title, Bob's Marriage Repair Kit, appears in a thick sans serif title-cased font, and below that and to the left, there's an underlined all-capital subhead that says, A Promise Worth Keeping. Underneath that, in an italicized font, there are several short phrases in quotes. I take thee to be my own, from this day forward, and my life is yours, ... and because I love you. Below the title and to the right, there's a larger all-capital subhead that reads, A Lie at the Altar. Uh-oh. Under that subhead, you have what are essentially the liner notes, featuring several quotes from Bob Harrington about marriage, and I'm not going to read the quotes, but I will read this, which is not in quotes. ... These and many other subjects are extensively discussed in this vivid description of what marriage is supposed to be and should be in the eyes of God. This is Bob Harrington at his best, dealing with the most critical problem in America today, marriage. And these notes were written by, let me check my notes here. Who wrote those liner notes about Bob? Bob Harrington himself. Go figure. Below the liner notes, there's a strip of 4 black and white pictures of Bob. There are a couple of him by himself. There's another one in which he's kind of in mid-conversation with somebody, and another in which he's outdoors somewhere on his bent knees, leading a group of people who are also on bent knees, apparently in prayer. There are captions under each picture, but they don't really provide any context whatsoever for the pictures, just more tidbits about Bob, really. At the bottom left of the record cover, there are minimal credits. It credits a producer named Dr. C.A. Roberts, Houston, Texas, and sound engineer Russ Sturgeon, Nashville, Tennessee. Under that, there's an address and a phone number where you could call Bob. I bet you Bob was thankful that unlimited long distance was not a thing back then. But anyway, to the right of that, there's the World Records logo. And then to the right of that, there's a list of albums and books. Not all of them, but some of them. And the albums would cost you $6 a pop on vinyl, $7 on 8-track and cassette. Some of the titles include Four Biggest Fools, Bob the Baptist, It's Fun Being Saved, Bob and the Devil, and my personal favorite, Slop Bucket Repentance. And because I like to be so detailed that I'm also going to tell you what the record looks like, well, it's a 12-inch black vinyl record, as you'd probably expect. The label has a pale blue background, much like the color of Bob's shirt on the front cover. The text is maroon. Above the spindle hole, you see the words Bob Harrington in a script font. To the left of the spindle hole, there's a catalog number, BH number 5, and the side indicator. To the right of the spindle hole, there is a picture of Bob, who's holding apparently a Bible and standing under a street lamp with a sign on it that says Bourbon Street. And there's an old-timey yellow light fixture on top. Except for that yellow, the drawing is completely monochrome. Below the spindle hole, and in fact on the bottom edge of the label, really, it says Bob's Marriage Repair Kit in all capital letters. Now, the contents of the record itself, well, it is essentially a sermon. I don't know when or where it was recorded, but judging by the context of what he said, it was most likely recorded in New Orleans on or near Bourbon Street. Bob gives us some statistics about marriages. His whole theme really is that marriages are falling apart, and the statistics he gives, 25% of marriages at the time were second marriages. And why were they second marriages? Well, because 50% of all marriages ended in divorce, and I'm pretty sure that statistic is still pretty accurate to this day. According to Bob, what causes marriage to fall apart? Lack of love? And this is interesting. He says one of the two parties involved is a child. He doesn't mean a literal child. He means more like in terms of maturity, really. And he cites Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, saying that when you're an adult, you need to put away childish things. And the problem with a lot of marriages is that one or more adults in the relationship have not put away their childish things. He doesn't say what those childish things are, but he just says, get rid of them.
I can see some of you little prying properly. Oh, he's going to talk about sex in church. Well, you're supposed to go to pool hall.
Bob talks about how marriage is a holy thing because, at least in his view, marriage originated in the Bible. And he talks about stages of love. First, there's baby love, that is the love of a baby for itself.
People say, oh, that baby loves its mama. No, that baby doesn't love its mama. That baby loves that baby. That baby's in love with that baby. If you don't believe that baby loves that baby, you wait and see when that baby's going to squall most for food and water. It's always going to be at 1 o'clock a.m., 2 o'clock a.m., and if that baby loved mama, he could hang in that crib till 8 o'clock a.m. But that baby loves the baby.
One cause of marriage failure is that this is the phase of love some marriages are in. Either the bride or the groom has that baby love attitude of, I want what I want when I want it, and if I don't get it, I'm going to raise a big stink. The next stage of love he talks about is parent love. That is, love one has for one's parents, whether they're good or bad parents. The problem with marriages stuck in this phase is a wife trying to make her husband to be like her father, or a husband trying to make his wife to be like his mother.
Man, one time my wife was cooking something and she said, is this like your mama used to cook? I said, no, thank God it's not. I don't stop at any restaurant that says home cooked food like mama used to cook. My mama couldn't even open cans real well.
There's also gang love. I thought that was kind of an awkward term to use, but Bob explains that going back to childhood, like say when you're 8 or 9 years old, a typical boy would want to hang out with other boys. Yeah, I want to hang out with these boys because girls are icky, yuck. But the problem is, instead of taking care of their responsibilities as husbands and fathers, they want to hang out, get drinks with the guys, and they're happier hanging out with the guys than they are hanging out with their wives. Now, the way I'm explaining it, it may sound like Bob was being sexist. He was not, because later in the album, he also implies, if not explicitly states, that gang love also can be a problem with women. The next phase of love that Bob talks about that could hurt a marriage is what he called others love. I don't really know how to explain it because, to be quite honest, Bob didn't really do a good job of explaining it. He didn't talk about it in detail, but basically it kind of sounded like a slight variant of the gang love stage. Now, I just want to say right now that the timing on each side of the record seems to be very rigid at 22 and 23 minutes, and 23 minutes, I think, being the most you can cram on a record without sacrificing too much sound quality. So I do want to leave open the possibility that maybe in the actual sermon, Bob did go into great detail about what others' love is, what that phase is, but it didn't make it to the album very well. Now, the thing is, something that Bob said early on in his sermon is that the big problem with failing marriages is that one or both parties involved are not old enough for marriage. And he doesn't mean literally old enough, like, say you're not old enough if you're only 14 or you're old enough if you're like 18, 19, or 20. He meant old enough in that you're old enough to know that you have to be in the right phase to prepare yourself for marriage. And according to Bob, that stage is called God's ideal, which means that you're old enough to understand that marriage is holy and is for one man and one woman forever. Having said that, with that phrase, one man and one woman, I don't think he was trying to make any commentary on, say, non-heterosexual couples, but I think it was to emphasize staying faithful to one person forever, and he wanted to include both men and women in that. I don't think really that the possibility of gay marriage even entered his mind. Remember, this was 1974. But he did spend considerable time on the album, at least up to this point. We're still on side one, by the way, bashing people who keep getting remarried. So that's likely why he stated one man with one woman forever. And by the way, he called out Johnny Carson specifically as somebody who really needs to reevaluate himself given how many times he'd been married. And according to Bob, if you're old enough to get to this stage, God's ideal, then you are old enough to get married. The next thing that Bob talks about is what he considers another stage of happiness, which involves the importance of attitude. And he goes straight into what he considers to be the 5 keys to a happy marriage. What are the 5 keys to a happy marriage? Well, I can tell you one of them. One of them is the right mate. He said, if you're married but not to the right mate, don't just walk away from the marriage. You want to repair your mate, not replace your mate. He gets into that a little bit later in the record. Bob says that he can't imagine a quote-unquote saved person dating someone who is an antichrist or anti-believer, as he said. He goes on to say, you think you can change that person? Well, then if you're going to do that, then flip that person to being a believer first and then marry that person. Don't think you're going to do it after marriage. Bob then talks about a prayer that he heard his daughter Rhonda say as a teenager, asking God to take care of her future husband, whoever it may be. And then suddenly, side one comes to an abrupt end. That's it. That's side one. So you flip the record over and it just picks up right where you left off, I'm guessing at least. Finding the right mate, by the way, is the only actual key I remember hearing Bob mention. Again, I don't know if there were other keys he actually specified that maybe just got cut out in editing. But whatever the case, he goes on to say that, many people think that marriage is a 50-50 partnership. Bob disagreed. He said marriage is a 100-100. Each party in the marriage has to contribute 100%. One reason he cites marriage for failing is that many marriages fall apart because parents dedicate too much time to being parents, but they forget how to be husbands and how to be wives. Now, this is interesting because somebody I know very well actually told me that she believed that one reason that her parents' marriage failed was that her mother just literally forgot how to be a wife. She spent so much time being a mom that her husband was kind of neglected. And that wasn't the only cause, apparently, but that was a big cause, at least as this person saw it. And so maybe Bob has something there. He says another thing that could cause a marital problem is bad attitude towards sex. He doesn't really go into a lot of elaboration, but he does spend a lot of time kind of being silly about the concept of sex, if you will.
I can see some of you little prying properly. Oh, he's going to talk about sex in church. Well, you're supposed to go to pool hall.
But he says that if you want to have a successful marriage, that the two people involved have to have a goal that is, and I quote, bigger than the both of you. And that goal, and I quote again, better be God's will for your life and God's work. The next thing we hear is Bob asks the congregation,
Let's bow our heads as we pray.
and then the album is over. There's no prayer included. Now, again, Bob doesn't clearly enumerate the 5 keys to a happy marriage. Again, it might have been edited out, or maybe I just didn't pay enough attention while I was taking notes. I also found it kind of odd that this album is called Bob's Marriage Repair Kit, but Bob didn't talk about any kind of kit at all, and most of the record isn't even really about repairing a marriage, but about marrying the right partner in the first place. I also found it interesting that Bob seemingly acknowledged the existence of trans people. Remember, this is 1974 we're talking. He doesn't really say anything about them. Really, he just kind of implies that they exist. Very briefly, very blink and you miss it. And by the way, I should also mention perhaps that reminding you that this record is from 1974 and sensitivities were a little bit different back then, or maybe a lot different, I don't know. Bob does drop the R word, as we now call it these days, because it was not an offensive term back then. So if you go out seeking this record and you listen to it, just be prepared for that. I just wanted to put that disclaimer in there. Also want to disclaim that, again, it was 1974, but also keeping in mind that it was 1974 and also the context in which he used that word, it was not used with any intent of disrespect whatsoever. But overall, it seems that Bob was very, very disturbed by the number of failed marriages that existed and why failed marriages existed. And his whole modus operandi seemed to be to try to help people to prevent that from happening. He said that it bothered him that so many spouses end up being replaced rather than repaired. He talked about how he was so thankful that Joyce repaired him and didn't replace him. I wonder what he did exactly that needed repairs. Well, I think now is a good time to get back to Bob Harrington outside of the album. So what happened with Bob since that 1974 album? Well, in 1977, at the height of his popularity, he had an affair and he divorced Joyce. He married Zanya Laferny. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that name, but Zanya was the executive vice president of Bob's organization. The two of them moved to Clearwater Beach, and they authored at least one book together, The Power of Balanced Living, in 1983. Unfortunately, that marriage didn't last, and also unfortunately, I could not find when they got divorced. I do believe Zanya still lives in Clearwater Beach, though. During the 80s and the 90s, Bob became a motivational speaker, and apparently very successful at it, but he eventually went bankrupt. And during the rough times, Bob refused to go to church or even so much as look at a church steeple. Looking back, he blamed his failures on himself, saying that he was effectively, and I quote, confession, this part comes from his Wikipedia entry, flipping the bird to God. In 1989, while he was at a Miami hotel, Bob was beaten within an inch of his life. And that kind of helped him re-spark his interest in religion, and he started going to church again and attending Bible study. He moved back to New Orleans and spoke at various churches. He married Rebecca Harris Birdwell, his third wife, with whom he stayed until her death in 2010. In 1998, he was living in Mansfield, Texas, and he started preaching again, but he was simply called the Chaplain. Well, of course, he was in Texas, not New Orleans, so he couldn't really call himself the Chaplain of Bourbon Street. But anyway, in 2010, Bob moved to Stigler, Oklahoma, so that he could live closer to his younger daughter, Mitzi. After some years of suffering from dementia, Bob died of kidney failure at 2 a.m. Oklahoma time on July 4th, 2017. And as per his actual request, his epitaph reads, born September 2, 1927. Born again April 15, 1958. Died? He didn't. Transferred to heaven. And Bob's tombstone includes that picture of him under the Bourbon Street lamppost. So that's what I can tell you about Bob Harrington. Quite an interesting character. I don't think anything that I said gives justice to the kind of personality he exuded during his evangelizing. Maybe the sound samples that I include do. I don't know. But His showmanship cannot be understated. And having said that, I'm going to completely change the subject and go into Sean's record collecting thoughts. For this installment of Sean's record collecting thoughts, I confess that there's going to be barely anything about record collecting per se, a little bit in the beginning and a little bit in the end. So let me start with what little there is about record collecting. Kind of an addendum to the whole "I know what I have" attitude that some vendors have, I guess. There's one thing that I can tell you that's a dead giveaway, that the album you are looking at is not a first pressing, original release, or whatever other term you might want to use. I don't know off the top of my head if any other record companies would do this, but I can tell you for sure that from about 1968 until the maybe early 80s, Capitol Records would sometimes put a little orangish, yellowish graphic on the album, and that graphic would say Gold Record Award, audited and certified by RIAA. Now, whether it be Capitol or any other record company proclaiming that it's a gold or platinum record, that tells you right away it's not a first pressing. After all, you cannot possibly have an RIAA certified award until the record has sold a certain number of copies. And in fact, a release isn't even eligible for that certification until at least 30 days after its original release. And that, my friends, is what I want to talk about, RIAA certifications. First of all, in case you don't know exactly what the RIAA is and does, here's a very brief description, and I'm taking the lazy way out, and I'm reading you what it says on its Wikipedia entry. And I quote, "The Recording Industry Association of America is a trade organization that represents the music recording industry in the United States." End of quote. That's a broad explanation right there. According to the What We Do section of its website, the RIAA, and I quote, "works to protect the artist's creative freedom, fight for state and federal policies that strengthen the modern music ecosystem, and explain the work labels do to support their artist partners." So that's what they say. Long story short, they'll sue you if they think you're pirating music. Got it? Got it. As a record collector, or maybe if you've tinkered with some sound processing software, including Audacity, you may have come across a thing called the RIAA curve. What is the RIAA curve? It is a standard of sound equalization for records specifically that the RIAA came up with in 1954 in an attempt to improve sound quality and also to protect the stylus and the record groove from damage during playback. Basically, one thing the RIAA curve will do is it'll kind of help the stylus from going airborne during playback. That could happen if the record is mastered with too much bass or too much volume. The RIAA curve helps prevent that and other things. But I'm not going to go into the gory details about the RIAA curve. I just wanted to put it out there that that's another thing that the RIAA has done. But of course, the main reason that I wanted to bring up the RIAA, good grief, I'm saying RIAA a lot, aren't I? But I'm bringing it up because the RIAA is the official authority to certify recordings as gold, platinum, diamond, etc., in the United States. In 2 of the last 4 episodes of My Weird Record Collection, this one included, I had reason to question the claims about the artist's certifications in various sources that I encountered. You might remember that in episode 12, I found numerous references claiming that Lil Wally Yagiello, which actually might be pronounced Yagiello now that I think about it, but anyway, they claim that he earned 17 gold records and 4 platinum. And of course, you heard me moments ago say that Bob Harrington allegedly won 2 gold record awards. In both Lil Wally's and Bob's cases, I searched the RIAA database on their website and found that, well, there were no certifications to be found on either of them. I should make it clear that the segment you are listening to right now is actually the very last one that I recorded for this episode, and I didn't really look into what I'm about to say until just before I recorded this. So you might hear me kind of contradict a couple of things I might have already said. Anywho, in both episodes 12 and 15, I did entertain the possibility that the RIAA's online database might not be totally up to date. That's reasonable to assume, right? I mean, of course, they're going to put priority on some of the more popular artists, like, say, the Beatles, Taylor Swift, and maybe some of the lesser-known artists, like, say, Bob Harrington and Lil Wally. They're just not really given that much attention. But according to some searching I did on various search engines, apparently their database is up to date. So why do Bob's and Wally's biographers claim gold and platinum records? There are a few possibilities. First of all, the adage, "Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story," comes to mind. Those claims of gold and platinum records might just be PR fluff. It happens. Another possibility? It could be that the records sold enough, technically, to be considered gold and platinum, but the RIAA just never actually certified the records. Now, just to give you an idea of how things get certified, if the RIAA's findings are that a record album, I'm just talking about albums, not singles, if a record album sells 500,000 units, it's gold. 1 million qualifies it for platinum. 2 million or more, multi-platinum. 10 million, that's diamond. This is according to current standards. 1 unit refers to the number of discs. Remember, earlier I said that a 2-record set counts as 2 units, and ergo, it only needs to sell 250,000 copies to qualify for gold. That rule specifically applies to titles that were first released during what is considered the vinyl era. That is, when records and tapes were the primary distribution media for music. Starting with the digital era, when compact discs were the standard, the rule for multi-disc sets counting as multiple units was changed. So nowadays, if you release an album right now that in physical form consists of 2 discs, well, it has to contain at least 100 minutes of content in order to count as 2 units by the RIAA when certifying for gold or platinum. And that's why if you were to buy a brand new, currently available physical copy of the Beatles' self-titled album, that's the White Album, which is a 2-record set, even though it only has about 93 minutes of music, according to the RIAA, you are still buying 2 units because the album was initially released before the 100-minute rule was in effect. But why exactly did the RIAA not certify these albums for Lil Wally and Bob Harrington? There are 2 possibilities. For one, it could be that RIAA went ahead and audited the sales, but they just simply did not qualify. The other and more likely possibility is that the RIAA never actually audited the sales in the first place. It's up to the record label to request an RIAA audit for certification, and that costs money. The 2 record companies in question, JJ Records and World Records, weren't exactly major labels like, say, Capitol, RCA, or Motown, so they probably didn't have the budget to spend additional funds to have an auditor come in and count their sales. I don't know how much it would have cost back then, but currently it costs a record label $350 per certification if the label is a member of the RIAA, and there are bulk discounts. If the label is not a member of the RIAA, it costs $450 a pop with no bulk discounts. If your label is a member of the RIAA, and if the audited sales show that the title in question is eligible for multiple certifications, like, say, gold and platinum, well, then that $350 fee covers both certifications. If your label is not a member, well, then each of those certifications, the gold and the platinum on the same title, that's, again, $450 each. And on top of that, if it's your first time requesting an audit, you also have to cover any travel expenses incurred by the auditor. Whatever the case, you are guaranteed certification results within 30 days. And if in 30 days the results aren't available yet, like they just didn't finish in time or whatever, you get some of your money back, but not all of it. Basically, whether you're a member or non-member, you'll end up basically spending $250 per title if the certification determination is not reached within 30 days. So I can kind of understand why a smaller label might not even go through the expense of an RIAA audit. And another possibility that would explain why gold and platinum certifications are claimed, but there's no record of it with the RIAA, it could be theoretically that somebody else might have had custom gold and or platinum awards made up. This is not unheard of. I do believe in episode 12 I mentioned how VJ Records presented the Beatles with an internally made gold record award for sales of the album introducing the Beatles. So why would VJ do that instead of having the RIAA certify it? Well, because there are some shady practices happening at VJ Records. Ewart Abner, who was the president of the label, had a gambling problem, and in 1963 he embezzled company money to pay off his debts, rendering the company broke. They were unable to pay royalties to the artists on their roster, including the Beatles. VJ was handed an injunction that prevented them from selling records from the affected artists, freeing the artists up to seek out contracts with other labels. Now, in the meantime, the album introducing the Beatles, which would have been their first album in the United States, was scheduled for release on July 22nd, 1963. And in fact, many Beatles history books out there claim that that's when the album was released, but it was not. Because number one, there was an injunction telling VJ not to release anything by the Beatles, the Four Seasons, and some other bands. And also because VJ literally did not have the money to release the album. Flash forward a few months to the winter, the Beatles finally hit it big in America in December 1963, so VJ decided, you know what, we still have the master to the album, we can release it, and if we do, we're undoubtedly going to get sued because the Beatles are now under contract with Capitol, and we don't have the rights anymore technically, but we would be sued probably for less money than we'd ever make in sales. It turns out VJ was right. Number one, they got their asses sued off, and number two, the amount they were sued for was less than what they actually made in sales, so they still came out ahead. After some back and forth lawsuits, there was an agreement reached that VJ could retain the rights to the masters that they already had in their possession for a year, and then those rights would revert to Capitol Records, which is why in 1965, Introducing the Beatles was no longer made, and now Capitol released an album called The Early Beatles, which had pretty much the same content as Introducing the Beatles. But getting back to VJ Records' Gold Award to the Beatles, requesting an audit from the RIAA likely would have gotten the label into more troubles when the sales figures were found. Hence, VJ presented the group with a custom-made gold record award. So, with that in mind, it is theoretically possible that another organization or group or whatever presented Lil Wally with custom-made gold and platinum awards. Same with Bob Harrington. Maybe a church presented Bob with a gold record or something. Or another possibility, there was literally no gold or platinum award of any kind issued to either of these artists. But the powers that be just decided, well, these records sold over 500,000 copies. That's gold. We can claim gold. Well, no. If it's not certified, it doesn't count. You can brag all you want about actual sales figures, and you should. You really should. But if it's not certified by the RIAA, it's not even aluminum. Now, going back to another record collecting item relating to gold and platinum certification. If you're lucky enough to actually have one of these awards in your collection, believe it or not, some folks are fortunate enough to somehow have an official framed gold or platinum award. They might have gotten it from an auction or inheritance or some other way. Or even if you just see one in person, you might notice some peculiarities if you look closely. You might notice how the banded tracks on the record don't actually match the number of songs that are supposed to be there. Or perhaps you'll see that a banded track looks way too small to possibly fit a song that might be, say, 6 minutes long. John Densmore of The Doors noticed that on his Gold Record Award for The Doors' debut album. He saw both of those little idiosyncrasies. For one thing, there weren't enough banded tracks on the album side to account for the number of songs that were actually supposed to be there. And one of the bands was much too short to possibly hold the song that it was supposed to have. So he got curious and he literally smashed the glass on the frame so that he could access the gold record, play it, and hear exactly what was on it. He cleared away the glass pieces after he smashed it, and he found that it wasn't even a real vinyl record at all. It was a flexi disc. If you don't know what a flexi disc is, you've probably seen them, though. They're the thin plastic thingies that you would get from, say, a magazine. I think Guitar Player had those every now and then, and I think Kerrang as well. Or maybe if you are familiar with that McDonald's contest from the 80s that was on the record that you had to listen to, that's what a flexi disc is. And you didn't have to put a coin on the tone arm to keep the stylus from slipping. But anyway, John took the flexi disc out of the frame and he played it on his record player and found that it was an album of Rod McEwen reciting poetry. But really, next time you find yourself at, say, a Hard Rock Cafe or some other kind of museum-like atmosphere where they have a gold or platinum record framed on the wall, check it out. I think nowadays the actual gold and platinum awards really do accurately represent the real records. If you look at records that have been certified in, say, the last 10 or 20 years, the record is probably banded properly. And I think in the last several years, they've been using actual vinyl records to make the awards, maybe dyed in the gold or platinum color. I think after I finish the post-production of this episode, by the way, I'm going to actually call JJ Records and ask them specifically which Lil Wallies actually allegedly got those gold record awards and the platinums. Remember, friends, by the way, you still have a homework assignment to prove to me that Lil Wally actually did have a couple of charting songs. If you've heard this podcast before, you know that I like to rate the records, and you know how I do, but those of you who don't, guess what? I'm going to tell you exactly how I rate the records. Each record that I talk about, I rate on a scale of 1 through 5, inclusive on 5 factors. So each record will have a score somewhere between 5 and 25, also inclusive. I rate based on local interest or usefulness based on the contents of the record. Also, I take into account historical interest, that is, whether or not the record is a interesting sign of its time. And also, I rate the records on their uniqueness, weirdness, of course, and enjoyability. Now, thing is, for Bob's Marriage Repair Kit, I think I'm going to bend my rules a little bitty bit and rate the local interest factor and the usefulness factor, average them together to get one rating. For local interest, well, in his heyday, Bob was known as the Chaplain of Bourbon Street, and he was recognized by the mayor of New Orleans himself. And if there's one thing I know about New Orleans, it's a town with a lot of pride, and rightfully so. Should they be proud to claim Bob Harrington as one of their own? Well, I don't know. I'll just leave it up to New Orleanians. But I think I should rate the album 5 for local interest. Usefulness? Well, it depends, really. Whether or not you're the religious type, so much of what Bob says about what makes marriage work is absolutely true, speaking as somebody who's been happily married 25 years. Talking about being old enough to marry, well, mature enough, really, giving 100% to your marriage and whatnot. However, I am going to be a little bit wishy-washy and say that if you're not religious, the usefulness of this record deserves a 4, but if you are religious, I think it gets a 5. So let's give the usefulness rating a composite of 4.5, and now we average that with the 5 for local interest to get an even more composite usefulness and local interest rating of 4.75. And historical interest, well, I would have to think that had Bob not fallen on hard times and divorce in the 70s, he likely would have not given up his over-the-top evangelist career, and he probably would have helped usher in the televangelist era of the 80s. But even then, bring up Bob Harrington to anybody who bore witness to his activities in the 60s and 70s, and you'll probably get an earful. I hesitate to rate the album a 5, though, because, well, the record itself, the contents really are timeless. A lot of what he says about marriage statistics is still true 50 years later. But I think the record deserves a 4 for historical interest. Uniqueness? I don't know. On one hand, the record itself isn't all that uncommon, even though the copy that I own is the only one I've ever seen in my travels, including trips I've taken to the French Quarter, believe it or not. And I didn't even find mine in New Orleans, but at Laurie's Planet of Sound in Chicago's Lincoln Square neighborhood. I bought it on January 17th, 2019, after my class at the Old Town School of Folk Music was canceled for the day. Please don't ask me why I remember those details. Anyway, having not actually looked specifically for any records about marriage counseling, I can only guess that at some point in history, it was not unheard of for those kinds of records to exist. But by 1974, I would think that if you're going to partake in some kind of media to help you with your marriage, it would be a book and not a record. By 1974, records were made from music, really, let's be honest. So I'll give the uniqueness rating 3 out of 5. Now for weirdness, well, Bob's Marriage Repair Kit, quite simply, is kitschy and campy. It has a very loud front cover and liner notes on the back cover consisting of the performer praising himself. And there's a drawing of Bob on the label, and of course you're getting marriage advice from a guy who 3 years later would be divorced after cheating on his wife. The contents of the record itself even louder than the cover, and you know what, just everything about this record, I'm going to have to give the weirdness rating of 4. The thing that kept me from giving it a 5 is, well, again, Bob actually gives good advice on the record. And enjoyability, well, there's a lot of preaching on the record. It is very religious. But Bob Harrington, well, he was such an over-the-top, flamboyant guy that you can't help but get sucked into listening, whether or not you're religious at all. Bob had such a way of presenting himself, and he even brought in very personal stories from his own life to kind of underscore a lot of his points. So you get a little bit of the inner workings of Bob Harrington. He also clearly had a good sense of humor. Above all, Bob was a showman. When I listened to this album shortly after I bought it, I told somebody that with proper editing, the album actually could be passed off as a stand-up comedy record. Even if you have absolutely zero interest in religion at all, I think you'd find Bob's Marriage Repair Kit very enjoyable. You know what? Heck with it. I'll give the record a 5 out of 5 for enjoyability. So let's tally up those scores. 4.75 for local interest and usefulness, 4 for historical interest, 3 for uniqueness, 4 for weirdness, and 5 for enjoyability. If I did my math right, and I usually do, and even if I don't, I have a spreadsheet to help me, that's 20.75 overall. Pretty high rating, and in fact, that makes Bob's Marriage Repair Kit the second highest rated record covered so far in this podcast, placing it a spot above Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party, and number 2 only to the J.J. Newberry Memorial Store opening. And there you have it, my friends. Bob's Marriage Repair Kit by the unique Bob Harrington. Do you have any thoughts on this record or anything else relevant to the podcast? Well, in addition to the sound samples, you can actually hear the entire album on YouTube and probably some other sources. So if you want to listen for yourself, go right ahead and get back to me. But before I tell you about next month's episode, I'm going to tell you where you can send your thoughts. And of course, as I am wont to do, I will give credit where credit is due. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com. Fab4it is spelled F-A-B, the number 4, I-T. And that's very similar to the website for this podcast, which you can reach in whatever browser you choose to use at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. And by the way, I just added something to the My Weird Record Collection webpage, and that is a link from which you can buy me a coffee. I mean, it takes time and effort and a lot of energy to write, record, produce, and release a podcast episode, and been doing it for free for a year, and be nice to get a little bit of support in this way. So if you click on Buy Me a Coffee, well, that's a way you can donate money to help support this podcast. Just one thing, I don't like coffee, so I'm probably going to get tea instead. Don't tell the Buy Me a Coffee people that, okay? But it could also possibly fund more weird records with which I can produce episodes. You can also reach out to me on the various social networks where you will find my handle being My Weird Records. The podcast is on Facebook as well. You can simply do a search for My Weird Record Collection or go directly to facebook.com/MyWeirdRecords. You can also get this podcast on YouTube, where you'll find not only episodes of this podcast, but also, whenever possible, audio of the records that I discuss and occasional bonus videos concerning both my weird and not so weird record collections. And on the YouTube videos, I try to put in some visual aids as well. Not the most exciting videos, but you can actually see what I'm talking about there. So if you like listening to podcasts over YouTube, that option is there. Just search for My Weird Record Collection or go directly to youtube.com/@My Weird Record Collection. And of course, as you heard, by listening to this episode, I like to use sound samples from the records that I talk about. Well, sounds and music used in this podcast remain the property of their respective copyright holders, and they are used for commentary and review. Infringement is not intended. Big thanks goes to Tim Christ, also known as Shoebox, for letting me use his record, the Pac-Man EP, as the basis for the logo of this podcast. You can find Tim and his truly unique and must-listen-to music on his website at worm-quartet.web.ae. Special thanks also to my buddy Kevin Zerb for designing the logo artwork for this podcast. Kevin and his music and his podcasts, including his latest called Mono, are available on the web at zerbinator.com. It's zerbinator.com. Next month, those of you who listen to this podcast as it comes out, it's going to be March. Chicago became a city on March 4th, so the next episode is going to have a little Chicago theme to it. Want to know what the record's going to be? Well, you're going to have to listen to episode 16. But until then, this is Sean reminding you, support your local record store.
Riding out here the other day to the church here in town, I was pulling up behind a car and had this long-haired creature in front of me, and I thought, isn't that pretty? I'm going to blow my horn when I go by. And just as I got near it, I was going to give my horn a little toot, and it turned around, and she had a mustache all over her face. I said, oh, boy, I want to thank the Lord I didn't blow my horn, because if I had, he might have liked it.